I'm not sure if it's a good thing or a bad thing to have two economists on a panel. And we all know of the American president who used to plead for a one-handed economist because economists can never make up their minds. They always say on the one hand this, on the other hand that. But we have four hands up here, so my hope is that we'll be able to do justice to this very important and I think topical issue. We're going to look at natural resources, but the focus of this session is not going to be just a better understanding of natural resources and natural resource challenges on the African continent. We're going to focus on what strategic leadership questions you should be asking, what strategic leadership decisions we as Africans should be interrogating, and how could you, as Africa's next generation of security sector leaders, be better prepared to make those decisions in the months and the years ahead. And to do this, we're going to try and keep our discussion today within the context of Module 1, which looked at ethical leadership questions. And as we go on, my hope is that I will challenge you and you will challenge me to think creatively about this resource question which doesn't go away. It's been on the African continent even before the colonial times, and it's kind of, been the elephant in the room, whether you're thinking about economics, politics, or security across the continent since independence. We don't have a lot of time, and I want to leave a lot of opportunities for us to dialogue and Q&A, so I'm going to be relatively brief, hopefully. We're going to start by asking the question, why are natural resources important? And I know natural resources could mean any natural resource, but we're going to focus on the extractives, and particularly those in the mining sector. Why are they important for you as security and professionals? Generally, when you hear discussions about natural resources and conflict, or natural resources and security, people will talk about natural resources and development, talk about corruption, talk about the use and transparency. But if you think about it, we really don't ask the question, what is the theoretical framework within which this discussion could be had? There's a lot of anecdotal discussions going on about natural resources. Country X has oil, so corruption and doom, and it's going to be resource cursed. Country Y has diamonds. You're going to see warlords running all around. What's the theoretical framework? What explains this? And to help you think through these issues, we're going to go through three theoretical frameworks very quickly, and then talk a bit about some of the opportunities and challenges that this presents, and then close out with my take on some of the responsibilities that you as Africa's strategic leaders have in ensuring not just that natural resources become true national resources, but that your task as security sector professionals views the state not just as a political entity, but all that is within it, the citizens and the resources. All right. This is a little dated. It's from a 2004 publication, but it gives you some idea of this resource and conflict dynamic. And taking 4 examples from this publication called Wars for Africa's Wealth, you see that because of conflict, countries lost a lot of money that could have accrued from their natural resources had there not been conflict. So my first point to you is that the security natural resource nexus is important because it helps provide the financial and capital resources that countries need to develop. We see significant amounts of money lost historically by various countries. And these were estimates not made by us at the African Center, but by the authors of the War for Africa's Wealth. If you fast forward a little bit, you would see potential revenue. The first slide I showed you was how much certain countries have lost because of insecurity. Okay? That's a historical challenge. This slide tells you how much countries could gain on an annual basis because of natural resources. Significant amounts. If you take some of the petroleum-producing countries, take Nigeria, for instance, between the late 1970s and I think it was 2010, country has exported 350 billion US dollar equivalent. 350 billion US dollar equivalent. Think about what that could do in terms of development, what it could do in terms of security, what it could do in terms of socioeconomic indicators. This is a 2012 working paper, and the estimates were done by an economist at the IMF, showing the amounts of money, the average annual revenue from specific natural resources that could accrue. I'd also direct you to the third column, which is the investment column, because this is an angle that usually gets lost in the natural resources discussion. We say, oh, country X has just discovered oil, so there would be, you know, a lot of money around and there'll be so much by way of exports. But in order for those exports to be realized, in order for production to be realized, there's a lot of upfront investment for two reasons. One, Africa has a basic infrastructure gap. The roads, the railways, the infrastructure is just not there to support the viable use of these resources. But secondly, in terms of the industry-specific requirements, they're also pretty high. Drilling, pipelines, you know, freight cars, refrigeration, heating, where it's necessary. It's not there. And so there's a second part to this, that for these natural resources to become national resources, there's a lot of investment that's required from the outside. What does it have to do with security? Most of this investment is private capital, whether it's coming from the United States, from Brazil, from India, from Russia, from Europe, it's private capital. And where you have instability or insecurity, you would either not have this money coming in, or it will come in so expensive, i.e. in terms of the interest rates and the repayment rates, etc., that the country will not realize the maximum benefit from their natural resources. So two lessons here. One, as we saw in the first and the second slides, there's a tremendous financial potential for African countries in this realm. But secondly, for that potential to be realized, we really do need to have a security environment that is business-friendly, a security environment that is predictable, and a security environment that adheres to the rule of law. In those three areas, you all have a part to play. You all have a part to play, not just in terms of your specific areas of responsibility, but also in terms of thinking through innovative strategies to ensure that we do have the sort of environment that is conducive to both the industry and to business in general. So, as Dr. Malakias rightly pointed out, if you look across the continent, whether it is mineral or agricultural natural resources, the continent is endowed. but we need to now start understanding how these resources, over time and hopefully not, but in the future as well, they have a linkage with conflict and insecurity. If you read a lot of the literature, you'd leave with the impression that Africa is just full of people who can't manage stuff, who are bad and they are corrupt. That is why we have so much by way of natural resources, but not enough being translated into economic development, into stability and prosperity for all its people. That is not 100% true. So now what we want to do is look at 3 theoretical frameworks that would help you as security professionals understand how these issues are linked. The first one is what they call is more geographical. And this speaks to the location and the type of the natural resource. I know it's after lunch, so if I'm going too fast or anything is obtuse, please put your hand up and I'll be more than happy to explain this. This work looks at 2 important things. It looks at the type of natural resource. And by type, they're meaning how is it distributed geographically? If it is spread out, like the tin ores in northeastern DRC, or is it located in one place, like if you have an oil well or a gas well? Is it located in one place or is it spread out? That's the difference between the point, located in one place, generally, or spread out, diffused over space. And then they compare that with the location of the resource relative to the big towns. This is important because this speaks to natural resource exploitation where you have either a government at national level or at a local level that does not have the capacity to project authority, power, or security beyond the main towns. This is partly a governance challenge and partly a security challenge. What a number of researchers led by a French economist, Philippe Le Billion, in the 1990s and early 2000s, what they found out was that there was a relationship between the type of resource and its location and the likelihood that you're going to have certain types of unrest. I'll just take a couple. If you look at the bottom right-hand corner, warlordism and militias. Why would you have warlordism and militias when you have diffuse resources in the periphery? First of all, there's no control. There's no projection of power from the big towns. And secondly, because you don't have the resources all in one place, the groups find it difficult to have centralized control. So you have a number of militia roaming around. That's a lot more complex than if you had just a point, say an oil well, in an area that's far away from the center of administrative control. So the first theoretical framework, and if you think through this, it begins to make a bit of sense, relates to this location and type theory. The second looks at the relationship side of things, i.e., what's the relationship between the instability you're seeing and the natural resource. And the underlying theorem for this particular framework is called lootability. Okay, how easy is it to loot the particular resource? And that explains a lot of the greed versus grievance debate, i.e., is the instability because you have groups, militia, that are just greedy, they want to control the resources, or do they have a legitimate political grievance that they are acting out through this particular method? It's a very contentious discussion because there's a lot of numbers behind this theory that a lot of people have questioned. But it's important to be able to think through how groups who may or may not be part of the political establishment might use attacks or control over natural resources as a form of messaging. Is it a grievance, or is it just greed? So there's a lot of this relationship theory, and again, it has a lot to do with the efficacy of governance in the areas. How well governed is the space? The third tries to distinguish between what they call type 1 and type 2 relationships. Type 1 is where the conflict is financed and sustained by proceeds, and type 2 is where you actually have the groups wanting to control the natural resource itself. So, why have I gone over these three broad theories very quickly? There are three reasons. Firstly, because I think that if you think through the various explanations, you would probably come to the conclusion that the simplistic approach to just going to chase out the bad guys will not solve the problem. The linkages are a lot more interwoven, and the governance and security questions are central. And so to be able to approach the problem, you need to be able to address not just the insecurity and instability you're seeing now, but the underlying dynamics that led to this, that led to the perverse relationship between the two. The second reason why it is important for you to be able to understand the various explanations is because, for too long we have had simplistic explanations. And these simplistic explanations have led to policy responses that have not been helpful. They've just made the problem a lot worse. Look across the continent. It might start as a small protest against environmental damage, and in a few years, it's a full-blown, militia or rebel-type war. Because I think we really do need to be smart about not just how we analyze, but also how we develop policy responses to these problems to ensure that we safeguard our natural resources. The third reason why I think it's very important for us to go through all of these is for us to be able, as I said, as I alluded in the first point, is for us to be able to effectively analyze interrelationships. It's all connected. It's not just a rule of law problem or a security problem or a cross-border problem. It's linked to governance, linked to rule of law, linked to security, etc. So, now that we have, hopefully, a more nuanced appreciation of the theoretical and probably practical underpinnings of this whole dynamic, the natural resource and conflicts dynamic, what does this tell us about moving ahead? As we discussed in plenary 1, strategic leadership questions are all about looking in the outer years. How do you make decisions today that are going to move your country in a particular trajectory? The first, on my far right, your far left, is the expectation that if a country is at a low level, whether it's development or security, you're hoping that whatever policy responses you come up with would gradually improve things over time. So we'll see a smooth line. But in most African countries, because of the fragility of not just the institutions, but also the human resources and the systems, we see a more up and down, a little bit of improvement, and then it goes back to a negative. Then a bit of improvement, and it goes down again. Natural resource type conflicts are different because they are like the third one, where you have a strategic break, and it leads to a steep drop in economic outcomes, in social outcomes, and in security. And over time, if you get it right, things will bottom out, but they will then hopefully start improving. But the question is how we understand the nature of the natural resource-driven conflict is critical. It's different from other types of conflict. So countries that have natural resource endowments have peculiar challenges that they need to address. Okay, so we've talked a little bit about why it's important to understand natural resources. We've also talked a little bit about why it is important to have a bit of a sophisticated analysis of the natural resource issue on the African continent. And we've also talked a little bit about the importance of having a different strategic response, because what we have is not just the a normal development challenge, but the natural resource dynamic causes that structural break that challenges you as practitioners and policy folk. So if you have all of these things, there are a number of things that you guys should be thinking about and that you should be embracing. But before I talk about those, I want to just highlight some inherent challenges, not just in African countries, but in resource-rich environments as a whole. The first problem is that natural resources, as you noticed from the third slide, are multi-billion-dollar enterprises. Multi-billion-dollar enterprises. You don't sign a multi-billion-dollar contract every year. Some companies only sign one every 10 years, and it keeps them going and profitable for 10 years. This is what they call in literature a high-value, low-frequency contract. Because of high-value, low-frequency contracting, people will do things that they wouldn't normally do under usual circumstances. People will think about creative ways to not just get the contract, but creative ways to ensure that they maintain control of that contract over time. And this is not just an African issue. I remember many, many, many years ago, we working on petroleum, oil, gas, and security. One of the things we were looking at during my first tenure at the Africa Center was maritime security, which you talked about this morning. And we're thinking about, okay, how could we have creative ways to ensure that maritime domain awareness along the African coast is improved? So we did a lot of work, went to conferences. One of these conferences was in a European country, and I attended. And the conference was, you had the conference, and you also had a trade show. So the thinkers were in the auditorium, and the sellers were all in their booths outside. And I was walking around, enjoying the sights, enjoying all the booths, and I stopped at one particular booth that seemed to have a lot of, really cool stuff. I'm not a military person, I'm a practitioner, so I see, different types of radar and ships, so I stopped and I was looking at it. And somebody came up and said, would you like to see the video? Are you interested in this thing? I said, yep. And we went to the back room of the booth, of the kiosk, and they brought out this flashy display, and it says, this could do that, that could do this. And he said, are you from Africa? I was there representing the United States, but I said yes, which is not it's true, I'm from Africa. He says, will your country like to have one of these? And I said, this is a little expensive for my country. And he says, oh, don't worry. You scratch our back, we'll scratch yours. You just need to make sure it gets up to, I'm not kidding you. This was a Scandinavian. High value, low frequency contracts bring something in the dynamic that challenges everything we have discussed about ethics. It is not an easy decision. It challenges everything we have learned about ethics. And this is why, and I'll come to this towards the end, there are two important things that we really need to be able to do in this context. One, have a bit more transparency and accountability, and secondly, understand natural resources within the context of national security. High-value, low-frequency contracts also lead to something called the ostrich effect. The ostrich likes to bury its head in the sand and pretend that everything going around doesn't concern it. And this, unfortunately, in many African countries, is particularly true of the security sector. Because people, whether they're in uniform or just out of uniform, they have all these complicated contracting languages that would yield significant benefits to former security personnel or current security personnel, in terms of consultation fees, in terms of introduction fees, etc. The list can go on. And this is something that countries really have to be particularly wary of. The second inherent challenge is that while Africa is on the rise, most of the fastest growing economies on the planet are now in Africa. You have a lot of focus on, increasing democratization in Africa. A lot of the markets, domestic markets, are still very fragmented. And the political economy is problematic. And it's particularly problematic in countries that are recently emerging from conflict. One of the strategic shifts in conflict and security that's occurred over the last 50 years is that while in the past you had winners and losers when there was conflict, you know who won, you know who lost. You then have a truce, and second difference, in the past it was interstate. Now it is non-state actors who are a lot more difficult to deal with when it comes to negotiation, etc. So what we have in a disturbingly large proportion of African countries are post-conflict administrations that are compromise administrations by necessity. And what happens when you have the compromise administrations is that a lot of people are in power, not because of what they what their manifestos say about the nation, but they're in power because of what they stood for during the war. And that translates into governance, and it complicates the political economy. Because the people who make the decisions, the people who focus on resource-related security, are the same people who benefited from the war in the first place. Generally, in some countries, not in all countries, but in some countries. And this makes the political economy, either linkage between politics and economic issues, a little problematic, because it is increasingly difficult to have discussions and decisions that are based on the state that those individuals don't almost automatically translate into their own self interests. So the political economy is an issue. We also have the external influences. Africa has not mismanaged its resources alone, but with help from a number of external influences. But the other side to that is Africa is not the only place on the planet that is experiencing a resource boom. And we could learn a lot from other parts of the world how they handle some of these external influences. I'll skip, in the interest of time, I'll skip the corporate social responsibility, but I want to talk about the value chain governance. Because when we talk about natural resources, particularly, let's say, for example, the tin ores or diamonds, there's a very long value chain from when you dig it out of the earth to when it's exported from the country. And being able to provide security, governance, transparency, and accountability along the entire value chain becomes exceedingly problematic. So it's easy for the NGOs in New York and Geneva to say, we need transparency, we need accountability. But it is very difficult to do it in practice if you don't have control over your supply chain. I remember there was something called the Dodd-Frank Act in the United States, which relates to the mining of conflict minerals in and around the DRC. And, long story short, it now requires all companies listed in America to declare and certify that they bought 3 tin ores and gold from non-conflict sources. 2 weeks after this law came into being, about 2 months after it came into being, I got a call in my former employment from the vice president for Toyota. And said he wanted to come and discuss this thing. And I was thinking, why is Toyota interested? And he came over and said, we have tens of thousands of inputs into every car. There's no way we could certify for each one of those inputs exactly where the tin ores came from. If Toyota is finding it difficult to do with all their corporate know-how and all their capability, how much more most African countries? And so the value chain governance issue is an important one, and I think it's something for you to consider, because there are a lot of security elements to that, particularly in the initial stages, what literature calls the upstream side of exploration. All right, so what would I think that you should be thinking about as strategic leaders? First is, let's move away from the simplistic assumptions and the finger pointing to really understand the nature, scope, and value of our natural resources. The value side is important. I remember I went to an African country that was negotiating petroleum issues. And I met with the Minister of Mines, the Minister of Petroleum, his technical staff. They did not have a clue what their reserves were. They didn't have a clue. They only assumed how much they should be getting based on, what they believe, is being mined at any one point. We need to understand that, and why it's important for you as security folk to understand it, is that while African countries still, on average, spend less than 5% of their budgets on the security sector, total budget amount in Africa is increasing, which means that over time, you're going to be having to make decisions about a larger pool of money. And the decisions that you make, we'll be talking about budgeting and procurement on Wednesday, I think. The decisions that you make, should be based on, a firm knowledge of not just, what we think is there or what we read in the newspapers, but what we have, but what our analysis is telling us. The second thing I think you should be considering is we need to apply a human security lens to natural resources. We tend to think about natural resources as the goose, the proverbial goose that lays a golden egg, and it's just we're going to take, we're going to take, we're going to take, we're going to take. And oh, there's money to be spent, so let's spend it. But we really have to think about how those resources and the wealth that accrues from those resources fits within our construct of human security for our respective nations. That includes development, it includes the rule of law, it includes hard security. Third, I think that we need to understand potential flashpoints and work to preemptively diffuse tensions. We generally, if you do a lot of analysis of the three frameworks you talked about, you could more or less guess where trouble is about to brew. And a lot of the preemptive approaches to conflict management need not be kinetic. It might be development. It might be inclusive governance. It might be something that addresses some of those underlying issues we talked about earlier that would diffuse attention. I've been working with a group of social scientists in Switzerland on a database that analyzes attacks by non-state actors on natural resource infrastructure. The database is huge, almost 9,000 entries going back to the 1980s. But it's when you don't need really sophisticated analysis, but when you really do like first order rough analysis, you see the emergence of waves that seem to follow political and social events. You see clustering and vectors that tell you, why certain areas seem to be more prone to instability than others. And there's a lot that could be done preemptively to address these. Fourth, I think more African countries should fully participate in international governance initiatives, like the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, like the voluntary principles. A lot of African countries participate in terms of reporting, but very few participate in terms of internalizing the results of that reporting into governance and decision-making in the respective countries. There are let me think of an example. Liberia. The Liberian EITI, the Extractive Industries Transparency International. The Liberian EITI site, Google it. It has copies of most of the timber, most of the rubber, most of the oil contracts that have been signed. They're online. But I challenge you to understand them. But fully participating and internalizing means there's a lot of sensitization that has to go on. And also there's a lot of participation that you have to ensure that you build with civil society and non-governmental organizations. And lastly, I think we need to de-link conflict and natural resources in fragile regions. We tend to view natural resources as a conflict trigger. In some cases they are, and there are reasons for that. But we have to really take a forward-looking approach to get policies in place that would ensure that you're not just looking at them from a human security lens, but you have a game plan to ensure that their use is consistent with your human security lens. First of all, you see a lot of literature about the resource curse, that if countries have resources, they're going to be cursed. That's another big debate, but I do not believe that it is accurate for many reasons, and I'll be more than happy to discuss those in the Q&A and after. I don't think Africa is resource cursed. I think Africa has significant resource endowment, but being able to move from where African countries are now to a better place in 3 to 5 years requires not just focus on the industry, but a keener focus on security and governance. And that would only yield the desired ends if we have a more sophisticated way to analyze and approach these issues. And with that, I will stop and look forward to your questions.